Good afternoon, everybody. We're just letting more people come in. So welcome to the unofficial webinar. So this is not an Ofsted webinar. This is Finn. This is a team behind Finn who've come together. James Houston is with us as well to talk about the new inspection framework. So we're just letting a few more people in, and we'll move on. And in fact, I'm going to go to the first slide because I want you all to just sit and read this for a moment while we let everybody in. So welcome to today. My name, if you don't know me, is Kerry Buffy, and I'm the founder of the Fellowship Inspection Nominees, and I'm delighted to have with me James Houston and excuse me a second, and Peter, I will allow them to both introduce themselves in a moment. We wanted to take this opportunity for us to really have another look at this new inspection framework and think about what that means to Finn members and our guests who've come along today. We've got to let people in because we've got over 600 coming to today. So as I'm sure you can imagine, it takes a few minutes for everyone to get on. So we've got somebody saying they aren't able to see the slides. It would be really useful if other people could confirm if they can actually see the slide up on the screen. Well, I've got lots of people. Okay, so it must be just one or two. So, oh wow, fantastic! Got loads of thumbs up. That's a great way to start a session. So, I want us to think about what we're going to look at today. Is that the devil is in the details? A lot more to this framework than first meets the eye. So, what I'd like to do is I'd like Peter and James just to quickly introduce themselves. And then we will make a formal start. By then, we should have a lot of people in. Okay, Peter.
Good afternoon. I'm Peter Nelson, formerly HMI with Ofsted. When I was with Ofsted, I was part of the policy team, so I was involved with quite a lot of policy development and various framework developments and launches over the years.
Thank you. James.
And good afternoon, everybody. I'm James Houston. I'm the face behind all the Finn resources. So if you're a Finn member and you get access to the website, you'll find about 300 different resources there to support teaching and learning. My background is I was in learning and skills as a senior manager, and I escaped that to become an advisor. And I've worked with those culprits from Ofsted for about, I don't know, 16 years or something. So that's me.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed, both for your introductions. We've still got some people who can't see the screen, so I'm going to leave that with Hannah in the background so she can get in touch, and hopefully we'll be able to see the slides. I think the majority of you can. It's only a small number of you that can't see the slides. So welcome to this session today. So a little bit of housekeeping first. This is Finn's national networking event. You're on listen-only mode today. We are going to have an opportunity for Q&A over the session that we have. So please feel free to put questions that you want to in the Q&A or the chat box, and we will get to them as soon as we can. And we would like to thank our collaborators today, whose emblems are here, who've actually shared the invites to get as many as we can here today. So we really appreciate that. So just to move you swiftly on to the next slide, an overview of the session. And Peter, I'm going to hand over to you.
So what we're hoping to do over the course of this presentation is, first of all, start by giving a little bit of history and background of the changes that have been made and the process that has led up to that. Then we'll start to unpack some of the new framework for you. We'll look at provision types. We'll look at the judgments that are being made. We'll look at the grading process, and we'll look at a little bit of detail of each of those judgments, just to kind of give you a bit of an insight into the main judgments. Once we've done that, we'll also cover off some of the practicalities about the inspection process. And then we'll start to give a few ideas and thoughts from the Fin team. So their observations, having looked at the stuff in quite a fair amount of detail, some observations and some thoughts from us. And in addition, I'm sure many of you on the call attended the Ofsted webinars over the last week or so. There are just one or two sound bites that I've lifted from some of those webinars that I think are really important and salient, and I just wanted to highlight them to you. And in amongst all of that, Kerry will advise about some of the benefits of being a Fin member and some of the sort of products that are there to support you. So that just gives you a sort of basic oversight of what we're going to cover. Moving on.
Yep, perfect. Thank you very much. So moving on to a little bit of background. And Peter, I think you were going to give a flavour of where we've come from on this.
Yes, so I'm sure this picture is familiar to many of you. This is the old Education Inspection Framework, just a sort of one side of A4 summary of the entire methodology. Alongside this, I'm sure you'll be familiar with the fact that there was a Further Education and Skills Inspection Handbook. So there was one key document that it encapsulated all of this and also gave you a lot of information about the process of inspection, the timings, what happens before, during and after inspection. And we'll introduce in a minute what's replacing those. So the Education Inspection Framework, I think, came in from memory in about 2019. And about 18 months ago, just over 18 months ago, when the new Chief Inspector started, there was a big round of consultation called the Big Listen, when the Chief Inspector went out to the sector and sought some feedback about the sort of changes that they'd like to see. Then we got the idea that there was going to be some amendments to the frameworks, or even a potentially a new framework. The new one, as it is still called the Education Inspection Framework, but it is clearly been amended. So a round of consultation for the new framework. That closed in April. We were due to hear in June what the changes were, but in fact in June, Ofsted said we've not really had a chance yet to read and respond to all of the consultation responses. So they said, right, we're going to let you know what's going to happen in September. So that's sort of a bit of background. And then in September, we got a true insight into what is going to replace the old Education Inspection Framework.
Lovely, thank you very much indeed. We've got a number of people who still can't actually see the slides, so I suggest, Hannah, if you take Peter and myself off the screen, because they're saying they can see us but not the slides, that might help, and they might just then be able to see the screen. So let's have a go with that. Hopefully those of you who can't see the screen, that it just means you aren't now with a place with a blank screen. So let's see if that works. Thank you very much, Peter, for just talking a little bit about the Big Listen. When we look at the framework now, I do believe there's definitely a win for Fin there, and that is that when we've been feeding back to Ofsted and when we've been talking to them about what our members have found and seen, we fed back about the 5-day notice period. We felt very strongly that whatever size of provider, everyone's got the complexities. Everybody needs that time and that planning to actually, if they're working with employers, to organise their provision, to organise their people. And now it's that every provider, regardless of size, regardless of complexity, will have that 5 to 6 day notice period. And that will make a massive difference. So we think that's really, really important. We also asked for clarification on the barriers for learning under the inclusion, and we're pleased to see that. And also we challenged the wording in relation to the confidence and safeguarding process. Now, it is still there. I'm not going to go into the detail of that now, but it's certainly been, the word has been softened. There's also a few more subtle wins throughout some of the places where we challenge things. And what I'll talk about later on is our monthly meetings, when we get members together to talk about the detail of the framework. and we will share with you the wins along the way. So there's a few wins for Finn, so it does make a difference. If you let us know, we do speak on your behalf, so there really is a lot there. The other thing that Peter mentioned earlier was that he mentioned the Ofsted formal engagement process. Now, we have been trying to encourage people to log on to that, because that is Ofsted speaking, as it were, from the horse's mouth, and I don't mean that disrespectfully, but that is Ofsted speaking themselves. I know I've watched a couple of them. I'm going to watch a few more, but they will all be available on the Ofsted's YouTube channel. They're not available yet. I looked the other day, yesterday, but they will be available. And I think, Peter, you were going to say something about this, weren't you, as well?
Yes, there's although technically speaking, each of those separate events was aimed at a different audience. So adult learners, SEND, apprenticeship providers, and education programs for young people. There was an awful lot of overlap between the four of those presentations. And if you're going to just have a look at one, once they're up on YouTube, it might be best potentially just to look at the one that took place on Monday, the 29th of September, which was the education programs for young people, because they'd been through the webinar a few times by then, and arguably I think the messages were a little bit clearer in that one. But clearly, if you're just an apprenticeship provider, you may want to look at the apprenticeship one. But this is the unofficial version. I would very strongly encourage you to go and look at what Ofsted said by viewing those in due course if you haven't seen them already.
Yeah, I think it really is important to listen to them. Although I will be honest and perfectly honest with you and say, and Peter and I have had this conversation, and James, this isn't the answer to everything. I mean, there's a lot of questions out there that Ofsted haven't got the final answers yet. They're still working through it. We know that they've had the pilots. We know the framework is here, but there are still some questions going on. And if anybody says, I've got all the answers, I am an expert, then I would question, how do they know it? Because there's still a lot of things. And even today, we'll be sharing with you some of the questions that we are asking ourselves. I apologize for those of you who are still having problems. We're going to look at how we might be able to put each slide into the chat box, possibly so that people can see it, if Hannah, if that's going to be something that you might be able to do. But at the moment, there's nothing exciting. There's none of my pretty pictures in yet. It's just really a capture of what we're saying. So you haven't missed any of the juicy slides yet. So what we're going to do, what we're going to look at is that this is today's event today, when we're looking at unpacking the framework. And then what we're going to do is every month, and these are the first three, this is strictly for Finn members only, we're going to look at the real detail of the aspects of it as we go along. We've put the slides up, but please don't cheat, don't write ahead of us, because that's going to defeat the object. So these are for Finn members only, and these are going to be when we have a discussion and we go through each one. The first one is going to be with myself for next week, and we're going to look at governance and oversight and that shift in accountability, which I know Peter's going to talk to you about. Then in November, we're going to look at those barriers for learning and really talking about those different elements of it. And then when we go on to the next one in December, that will be with Gerard McGrath, looking at CPD and what the details of that. So we know that this isn't the answers all today. It's only part of the session today. Right, Peter.
So, as I said earlier, you will be familiar probably with the old Further Education and Skills Inspection Handbook. That has now been replaced by 3 key documents that you should be aware of. Perhaps the most important and fundamental of these is the Further Education and Skills Inspection Toolkit. So that breaks down in a lot of detail the various judgments that inspectors will make, and it gives you the criteria against which they use against which to judge you and award a grade. There are 2 other very useful documents. They're basically guidance. So Further Education and Skills Operating Guidance for Inspectors. So that is guidance for the inspectors as to how to run the inspection. It's there for all to see. So it's very useful as a provider to have a read of that. And then the third document is the Inspection Information for Further Education and Skills Providers, which is quite similar. Clearly, it just explains it from a slightly different standpoint, which is the provider standpoint. So there's a link at the bottom of that slide guide, which will take you to the site where you can find those 3 documents. And as you may have done during inspection in years gone by, walked around with the Further Education and Skills Inspection Handbook clasped to your chest, those are the 3 documents that I suggest you print off and have available. There are other ones as well, but those are the kind of the 3 core ones that are core to everything that's going on.
I think, Peter, it's worth mentioning this is a real step as well forward, because they've never actually had an operating guide for inspectors that they've ever shared before, have they? So this is really a step in the right direction of transparency.
Absolutely. It's very much underpinned by the whole idea of being as transparent as possible. And we'll talk more about that later, because even the training materials for inspectors are going to be available, but we'll mention that later. Moving on. So let's start by looking at the provision types, and ostensibly this is an area where things haven't changed, so I'm sure you'll be familiar with these. There are 4 provision types. There's education programs for young people, there's adult learning programs, there's apprenticeships, and there's provision for learners and apprentices with high needs. Arguably, my interpretation of this, the only thing that's changed is in that provision for learners and apprentices with high needs, the words and apprentices have been added. So there's a slightly stronger emphasis in that section, not only on high needs learners, but also apprentices with additional needs as well. So it'll be interesting just to kind of see the subtler nuances of that over time, and see whether anything is significantly different. But on the face of it, that has remained the same, and those 4 provision types continue as very much as they were before.
One of the things that Peter and I were talking about earlier was something, we don't have an answer for this at the moment, and that's the number when it comes to high needs. So you may well be, for example, an independent learning provider, but you may have a small number of EHCP learners. Now, what we haven't had, and we've both asked this on different webinars, both Peter and myself have asked this, about the minimum number it would take to suddenly get that element graded. And we know historically, if there was a small number, if there's 4 or 5, potentially under 10, they wouldn't necessarily report on that differently. We don't necessarily think that's going to be the case. We haven't had it formally responded to by Ofsted, but we believe, because the new focus of the framework is about inclusion and that no one gets left behind, we do feel that that's going to be, however small your number, you're going to get looked at and separated. We haven't had that confirmed yet, but that's certainly where we're coming from. Am I right, Peter, with what we were talking earlier about?
Yeah, absolutely.
So it'll be very interesting to see how that needs. As I've said, we don't have all the answers yet, but that's the way we are thinking that it's going to go.
Someone's put a comment up saying that they don't find the new toolkit particularly helpful. So hopefully we are kind of just doing a bit of analysis of that as we go through this presentation. That should shed some light on it, all being well, if you are struggling to kind of grasp the core content of that. Right, the learner types, the provider judgments remain very much the same. Let's look at the new judgment areas that are out under this framework. They basically fall into 2 sections. The first 4 on this list are areas that will be graded for the provider as a whole, and the 3 at the bottom there are areas that will be graded for each provision type that you happen to offer. So let's just look at those in a little bit more detail. And I don't think it's irrelevant to look at the order in which these appear in the document. The first one is safeguarding. So safeguarding before was important, but ostensibly it was a subset of leadership and management. Safeguarding now is very much a standalone judgment, and it's a binary judgment. It's either met or it's not met. So that, if you like, is right at the top of the list, and you will get one judgment for that across your entire organisation. The second area there, which is a new area, and I'm sure we'll talk about this as we go through, is inclusion. There's a very strong shift culturally in the new education inspection framework around promoting inclusion, and we'll talk more about that a bit later. The third area that's graded for the whole provider is leadership and governance. And perhaps the point here to bear in mind is governance was discussed under leadership and management before, but it didn't per se appear in the title. So I think it's not an entire coincidence that the word governance appears in the title. And for those colleagues on the call that don't have a governing body as such, they may not have governors. I think that the parlance of using the word governance underpins it's not just around the job done by governors, but the whole governance framework. And the fourth area that's graded across the whole provision is contribution to meeting the skills needs. Now, this was a sub-judgment before under leadership and management, and this is a judgment that is only made for, as it says in the brackets there, GFE or general further education colleges, sixth form colleges and designated institutions. So it's only for those providers that judgment is actually awarded a grade. I will talk more about that later, because even if you're not a GFE sixth form college or designated institutions, I would argue that there's some actually very valuable information that you may wish to look at under that section, just in terms of informing your broader strategic landscape. Then you've got three more judgments, and these are made for each learner type. So, for example, if you offer education programs for young people and apprenticeships, you're going to get grades against these three for each of those two areas. These judgments are curriculum, teaching and learning, secondly, achievement, and thirdly, participation and development. And in a minute, we'll go through each of those in turn and just kind of give you a bit of a flavour for what each of those entail.
Thank you, Peter.
And the grading, this is quite different to what we had before, and I'm sure you probably have heard about this. We've gone from what was a 4-point scale to a 5-point scale. Not only that, but there's this kind of color coding or RAG rating for those judgments, and they go from the bottom, which is urgent improvement, which is red, up to needs attention, which is your amber. And then in the middle, you've got expected standard, and that's the point from which inspectors will start to see whether or not you meet that, and then they'll potentially go up or down from there. Then above that, you've got strong standard, and then you've got an exceptional judgment. As it says in this slide, no longer will Ofsted award an overall effectiveness grade for your organisation. And the only slight difference here is we're not having a 5-point scale used for safeguarding, because that's met or not met. And the other slight change is around the judgment on contributions to meeting skills needs. That previously was on a sort of 3-point scale as a subset of leadership and management. That now stands on its own and is awarded one of these 5 grades. So that's also a subtle difference to the changes.
For those of you who like myself and Peter, listen to those Ofsted formal webinars, you will have heard them talk about the fact that they are coming in looking at expected standards. So they're coming in with that as their main focus, with an assumption, but in the most positive way, of, are you meeting the expected standard, or have you got more? So in other words, when you then look at the strong standard, it builds on the expected standard, or if you don't meet that criteria for expected, then it needs attention. So when you first look at it at a glance, it's almost as if we've moved from a 4-point scale to almost a 3-point scale, with an exceptionally good and exceptionally weak. So it's they're starting in the middle, which is quite an interesting approach. And I'm kind of glad that they're going down that route of saying, well, we're going to look at expected standards there to see if you meet that criteria. And if you do, is it over and above it? Does it keep going up, or does it go down? So it's an interesting, it's not just visual, it's a kind of almost an approach that is quite different and quite refreshing. But when we look onto the aspect of the next one, which is the toolkit, it's that what is important to remember is that when Peter talked about those whole provision grades, that's what everyone gets graded once. Then you've got the criteria. If it's by provision type, you then get graded all over again. So that criteria in the toolkit, which is really quite extensive, and we'll come on to secure fit and best fit in a moment, but there's a lot of criteria there to meet. You will get graded on that for every single provision, and that's why you'll end up with so many grades. So it's really important to see that. So we've got here, somebody's just come up with a question, but we'll come to the questions in the end, because I'm hoping the next slide will help you visualize it a little bit. And that is that if we look at the first top here, we've got that whole provider. So that whole provider will be graded on one of those on the top section of this slide. The bottom half of the section will be for each provision type. So for example, you may get expected standard for curriculum and teaching for your one program, but they're going to look at it again for your SEND provision. They're going to look at it for your high needs. They're going to look at it again if you've got apprenticeships. So that criteria will be met several times depending on how extensive your provision is. And that's why some providers think of is it something like 16 different areas, Peter, or something? There's been a lot of
the total number of grades you can be awarded is 16. Yeah. So if you're a general further education college, you're going to get 4 overarching grades, and potentially you're going to offer all 4 learner types, and you're going to get 3 grades under each of those. So a total of 16 grades.
And I think that's an awful lot more than it would first, when you first look at that framework and you look at the talk and you look at that criteria, for you to kind of say, well, we've got that in this area, and we've got that in that area, not necessarily in every single area. What you need to do is separate them out and have a look at that criteria, because you can't flip it. You can't say, well, we haven't done it in apprenticeships, but we've got it for our study programs. Does that count? Because the answer is no. It's about meeting that criteria under that program type. So I think that's going to be a real challenge for providers, getting their kind of head around it. It took me quite a while, and the only way I was able to do it was by getting this big picture out to say, so how many times will that happen? So I think that's something that we need to be mindful. I'd like us to go on to now onto something that Peter and I have had several conversations about this, and that's this best fit versus secure fit. So previously in previous frameworks, Ofsted inspectors would look at the criteria and they would consider what would be a best fit, which meant that not every single line had to be met. It would be more of a professional overview to have a look at what's the best fit for that provider in that judgment. A secure fit is very different in that every single criteria has to be met. It has to be fully met, and then if it isn't fully met in that criteria, you will be moved down to the lower grade. So if you've got a criteria that is not being met, you will then move to that lower grade. So they have to make sure that secure fit is everything in there. Peter, do you want to add any more detail to that?
Yes, as you'll see in slides to come, Ofsted are absolutely emphatic that this is not a checklist activity. But on the face of it, you think, well, how is it not a checklist activity when they're promoting this secure fit model? And I think ultimately time will tell how pragmatic inspectors approach this and how they use it. I think it might be an interesting talking point over the first few months of inspection to see how inspectors interpreted this. But it seems to be quite a significant shift from the old best fit model to the new secure fit model.
And I think it's worth everybody just taking a moment to understand that difference between that best fit and that secure fit, because when you are looking at how you would self-assess yourself, when you are looking at how your provision is viewed, you need to understand that you have to take it very carefully to say, do we meet that criteria? How have we got the evidence for that? Where is the evidence for that? And then again, under that program type, so that secure fit is for each different program type, and I think that's where we're going to have the problem. And you know, we've had this conversation ourselves about it's not a checklist, and Ofsted have made it clear it's not a checklist, but by default it does become a checklist to a degree. And I believe, and this is just my opinion, I believe in the beginning, in the early days, inspectors will, to a degree, have to use it as a checklist because they won't have that flexibility. And certainly, you know, one of the criticisms of Ofsted is a lack of consistency. And to a degree, the secure fit model is the best way of ensuring consistency. So I can see why they've done it, and it might be over a period of time. I would suggest that actually potentially we might be looking in a few months' time of maybe some slight adjustments to it. That's nothing, I don't know any secrets. That could just be that they might have a look at it, because the first process, and I think Peter's going to talk about this later on, is a little bit how they're going to make sure that everybody is confident at understanding the toolkit, because so far they've only had the pilots, whereas now it's going to have that standardized approach coming out through inspection. But I wanted us to just really visualize that best fit, secure fit, so that everybody understood what that means. And I'm going to have a look through the questions in a moment when I hand over to Peter and have a look at what we might need to come back to, because I think that best fit and secure fit is going to create quite a lot of questions. I also want to be perfectly honest about the fact that this isn't going to be the answer to all of your questions all in one go. Hopefully we are a step closer, we're a step beyond what Ofsted, they provided the first information, we're now providing you with a bit more. But as I've already said, we're going to have these monthly meetings, and I'm really looking forward to sitting. I think it's about 150 already registered on next week's meeting, when we're going to literally look at that criteria under that governance and oversight, and about that accountability. So we're going to have that dialogue to say, this is what this means. If it's secure fit, how does that work out? And I think that's that next process that people need to go through, is really going through the detail of understanding it and be able to challenge it and interrogate it and share ideas. And that's why the first three we've got are the barriers to learning, which we know inclusion's a massive, big new piece of work. And then we're going to look at that CPD and that workload and management of that. So those are the first three, but within the next week or so, we'll be publishing what we're going to be doing for the 6 months after that with the new sessions. Right, let me move on to the next slide, which will give me a chance to have a quick look at some of these questions.
So I think it's useful just to kind of try and give a little bit of detail under each of the judgments. This is something that Ofsted didn't do in its webinar, probably because it was thinking, well, actually, you can go and read them for yourselves. But what I've tried to do here, rather than give you sort of all the minute detail, is just kind of give you a flavour of what's under each of these judgments. And I'll try and highlight where I think things are similar to what they were before, and maybe whether there are perhaps some subtle differences. So as I said earlier, safeguarding is at the top of the list. And this hasn't really changed dramatically, other than the fact that it's slightly higher profile. There's a philosophy around having a culture of safety across the organisation, and inspectors are going to be looking for to check that culture has been embedded in what they see. Policies and responsibilities, clearly you want to make sure you've got your policies in place. I can almost guarantee that inspectors aren't going to spend hours and hours and hours looking at the policies. They're much more interested in seeing how policies and procedures are actually actioned in practice. So they'll spend the majority of their time, I would anticipate, talking to learners, talking to staff about how those various processes run and how smoothly they run and what impact they have and how effective they are. Interestingly, there's this focus here under leadership and governance response to safeguarding, and this really clearly hints at the fact that governors, as they should have before, I suggest, but perhaps even more so now, need to be cited on what's going on with regards to any safeguarding related issues that come up, how they're being dealt with, and so forth. And generally speaking, governors once or twice a year tend to receive a sort of high level support on the sort of issues that colleagues have been dealing with and the designated safeguarding leader's been dealing with, and the sort of actions that are being taken. So I strongly suggest that's the sort of thing that you need to continue with. And then the final bullet there really is around recruitment and training, making sure that the safer recruitment in practices, practices in place and making sure that staff and governors are receiving suitable quality of safeguarding training, and that everything is truly embedded. And don't forget that prevent is very much a subset of safeguarding. They work really alongside each other. So there's just as much emphasis on prevent as there was before. So that gives you a bit of a flavour of safeguarding. One whole judgment for the organisation on that binary not met or met. Moving on to the next one.
Just before we go on to that next one, I'm not going to go into the detail now, but there's quite a big question to ask on the safeguarding about perception, and on the Fin monthly Unwrapped, we're going to look at that in more detail to understand what exactly that means and how that could be interpreted. One other question that came up that I think it's worth asking is about, our understanding is that it's not a limiting grade. However, somebody has put in, is there any chance that somebody could have not met the safeguarding and still move on to be exceptional? Because there is so much throughout the new framework about inclusion and about leaving people behind, I cannot see that as being a possibility. In fact, it's going to be some serious issues if a provider is not meeting safeguarding, and that's why it's at the very front of the framework. Anything you want to add to that, Peter?
Yes, I don't want to go into it in detail here because I don't really understand exactly how this process is going to work, but there is mention in the guidance about the fact that if learners are safe, but there's some process related issues that are not fully in place, inspectors could potentially pause the inspection, give the provider a short window of opportunity of making sure all their ducks in a row, and then starting the inspection again. I mean, I've no idea how that's going to work in practice, but it's something, it's there and it's in the guidance, and it's worth having a little look at. But it's best avoided. It's best to make sure that your policies and processes are there, they're effective, and you don't have to kind of revisit it.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Second one is inclusion, which again is graded at a whole provider level. This is the new one, which obviously there was a lot of elements of this, I think, embedded across the various judgments previously, but it's no coincidence that this is now, if you like, a headline area to be graded. There's an interesting article actually that we found. A chief inspector was making a speech somewhere and basically highlighting the fact that when he was at school, I think he had a long-term illness, which meant that he struggled at school, and he's absolutely adamant that any learner, irrespective of their background, should have equal opportunity and equal access to learning. And that's really what this judgment's there to flesh out. It's around setting high expectations of learners, and there's some very clear parameters about what classifies as sort of learners at risk, or those learners that this applies to most. So the stuff around previously receiving free school meals, those from low-income families, those with special educational needs and disabilities, those on education healthcare plans, care leavers, and those known to the youth justice system. I think ultimately there were sort of 4 classifications that were identified in the Ofsted webinar, but that seemed to be a sort of myriad of different groups. Now, I think the important thing to bear in mind there is that you potentially need to know which of your learners may fall into one of those categories. Now, for some, that may be very clear, but for others, it may not be, particularly if you've got adult learners. And if they're young adults, you may not know necessarily whether they come from a disadvantaged background or whatever. So it's possibly a thing that you just need to bear in mind. Make sure that you've got sufficient information about your learners to see whether or not they fall into one of those groups. I like the second one, the whole idea about the organisation creating a respectful environment. This is again to do with the culture of the organisation, and to make sure that that inclusive approach is embedded within the culture and the ethos of the organisation. Providers must create environments where all learners feel respected, valued and supported to foster inclusion. It's some good stuff to read, really. Supporting diverse needs, clearly to make sure that the curriculum is there, it accommodates those specific needs, and teachers, where appropriate, adapt and focus on those learners that may be disadvantaged. And that final one, which really I think is probably duplicating that to some extent, fostering an inclusive culture. So you'll see there, there's a lot of new stuff. Some of it was kind of there or thereabouts before, but it's much more high profile than it was before. So I think it's worth a good coat of thought as to how that impacts your particular organisation.
I think, Peter, this one's really interesting for further education and skills, because actually this is something that I think you've been doing really well for a long time.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you've actually done this without realising it, without capturing it. You've rolled up your sleeves and thought, what does that learner need? What does that apprentice need? How can we progress them? What can we do? So I've seen, out and about, so many different adaptations of resources, of styles, of doing different things to get people in the best possible place. What we haven't done before, and what not everyone is very good at, is collecting the data and the evidence on it. So I think this is going to be a big data piece. To do this properly, to be able to demonstrate what you do, you're going to have to take those starting points very seriously. You're going to have to think about how you capture this. I think one of the questions is going to be, and we haven't had this answered yet from Ofsted, is that when you've got somebody who doesn't want to declare it, how are we going to find out whether they fit in that category? And if they've worked hard to disguise their background or some of the barriers that they have, again, it's about evidencing it. So I think there's a lot more questions to come over this. And I don't mind saying this, certainly from behind the scenes on a number of the pilots, rather than focus, they actually use the word, it became an obsession. So you need to understand that when this comes, this really comes, it's like a waterfall, it's coming massively. And it really is going to be very, very important to those inspectors to find the evidence, to understand who you've helped, why you've helped them, and as a result of that help, what difference has it made? So it's about making sure that you can analyze your data, your early leavers, your achievers, the progress that people are making, and you can demonstrate that you have basically leveled the playing field for everybody so that everyone has that same chance. And interesting enough, and it came up on the official Ofsted website, it talked about illnesses. And when you read the Sir Martin Oliver story, which we have put a link into, that's some of his own personal experiences, that he's almost looking back and saying that as a result of some dedicated teachers, he didn't fall behind, rather than there was a process in place to make sure nobody fell behind. And I think that's what he's looking for from his own personal experiences, to make sure that there are sufficiently robust processes in place so that nobody gets left behind, so that we do meet those needs of all our learners. I'm just going to have a look at some of the other questions that are cropping up, but that's with the inclusion piece. So I think the inclusion, we need to brace ourselves ready. That's one of the biggest change, is about formalizing that process for inclusion. Peter,
Next,
are you just reading some of the comments?
No, I was just making sure I was one slide ahead, actually. Right, so the third overarching grade is leadership and governance. Some changes here, much of what was there by and large under leadership and management previously. So there's clarity of vision and strategic direction for leaders. I always think your vision, mission, ethos, values statements are really fundamentally important in any organisation. From my experience as an inspector, the organisations I've inspected over the years where that vision, mission, ethos and values are truly embedded in all that an organisation stands for, those organisations tend to do best. Where they're just, rhetoric in a policy document, rather less so, I suggest. So that stuff's there and it's very important. Obviously reinforcing the inclusive culture, again, as mentioned there. I like the idea of ethical decision making, which forms the foundation of a positive organisational culture, and governance, and this word governance crops up a few times here. There's a strong emphasis on continuous improvement. I'll talk more about this later, but there's a real expectation that organisations know where their weaknesses are, they know where their strengths are, and they can clearly talk about what they're doing about the areas where they want to improve. So you need to know where you stand, and that was there before, but it's really quite strongly emphasised, I suggest, this time around. Care of staff gets a slightly higher profile than previously, and clearly this all stems back to the original big listen when the new chief inspector started, and his really strong desire, first of all, to remove any of the stress or as much as possible of the stress associated with the inspection process, but also making sure that within the organisations, staff have sufficient time to do what they need to do, and they also have access to appropriate CPD. And then finally there, before Kerry jumps in, governance, oversight, challenge and accountability, real strong emphasis here. So making sure that there is strong governance structures in place. It doesn't have to be a board of governors, but I suggest that every organisation needs to have some sort of checks and balances in place, particularly if the board is made up of the directors. So they're executive directors, but they're also the board. You do need to consider how you're getting some sort of level of third party involvement there. So something to think about. And again, it's around governance supporting performance through oversight mechanisms. So as I suggested with safeguarding earlier, that seems to hint quite strongly at the fact that governors or the governance process needs to have oversight of safeguarding. Similarly, it needs to have oversight of quality mechanisms, performance mechanisms, and so forth.
This is going to be parts of this are actually going to be in our first inspection unwrapped next week. So I'm actually looking forward to having a lot more of a detailed conversation about certain aspects of this. I think the word in there that is different is accountability. There's a lot more accountability. So providing governance as I do for a number of providers, I can't do what I've always done. I have got to get a lot more deeply involved with the provision to scrutinise it to meet the new criteria. So providers, if you've got governance in place, you can't just say, yeah, well, it's fine, it's no different. It is. There's a lot more accountability built in. And it's really important that you understand where that accountability is built in, because otherwise it's going to catch a lot of people out. So it's about getting it unwrapped and having an more in-depth conversation about understanding it and understanding where it sits in your provision.
Just one other point to make here. Sorry, can we just go back?
Yeah.
A point I often make, I think people sometimes incorrectly suggest that leadership is to do with what the senior leaders do. I would argue that everyone within your organisation is a leader. So when a teacher is in a classroom, they are leading the process within that classroom, or a trainer is in a training environment, they are leading that training process. So leadership is not just to do with what senior leaders do, it's to do with leadership across the organisation. And that's something not to forget, I suggest. Okay, moving on.
Lovely, thank you very much. I've just noticed a question, and I'm not sure, it doesn't say who the question's from, and it's about kind of ambiguity in some of the grading criteria for inclusion. I'm not sure whether you're a FIN member. If you can let Hannah know if you are a FIN member, and we will make sure that we cover that in detail in one of the sessions, because we have got the one in November is going to talk about inclusion, and we won't have time to go through that today. But do let Hannah know if you're a FIN member, and we'll make sure that question is specifically covered in the FIN Unwrapped monthly sessions. Okay, next one. Peter.
Contributing to meeting the skills needs. So this is only applicable to general further education, sixth form and designated institutions. Having said that, for example, if you're an adult community learning provider, whilst you may not get a grade for this, I think some of the pointers in the toolkit are very useful for you to consider, because first and foremost, you are serving your community. So you want to be contributing to the skills needs of that community. So whilst this may not be graded, I think there's some relevant and pertinent stuff to consider under general leadership, governance and management within your organisation. But for those organisations that are graded, clearly it's around judging the extent to which there's alignment with the skills priorities of your area. That's of employers, of local community, of voluntary groups and so forth. Clearly, the the higher the level of employer involvement with what's going on in the organisation, the better. So that's making sure that you're, for example, have apprenticeship programs that serve local industry. It's ensuring that employers are coming in and contributing to, if you like, to the design of some of the curriculum. And they may be involved to some extent in shaping assignments and assessments and so forth. Adaptability to the labour market, so providers demonstrate flexibility to adapt education programmes to changing labour market needs and trends. Again, it's the flexibility, making sure that if all of a sudden a large employer in your area goes into liquidation, how can you step in to support those former employees from that organisation? And considering the community and economic impact of the whole thing. So that hasn't changed dramatically, but even if that's not graded, I think there's some useful stuff to reflect on and consider strategically for your organisation. So don't just pass it by and ignore it. Some interesting pointers there, I suggest.
There is, and I know James and I in the past have had conversations about this, because we very strongly believe that you shouldn't do things just for inspection. But actually, and I challenged Peter this morning about this when we had a conversation. I said, they've got enough to do. Is this really necessary? But actually, when you look at the detail, you can use the evidence that meets this criteria for other areas to demonstrate
Absolutely.
impact of achievement. You can use it to demonstrate meeting the needs of the local area. You can not just specifically for this section, but more about how your curriculum design, how the content, how the offer that you have is meeting those needs. So anything that you do within this criteria is not wasted. There are other places very clearly within the framework that you can use it as evidence. And again, that's something that we'll cover in other meetings. So you wouldn't just be doing this just because it's nice to have. You would be doing it to actually meet a specific purpose. And I know that James has got a lot of resources on the Fin website about the careers advice and guidance, about that recruitment with integrity. And a lot of this comes into that recruitment with integrity, which we know builds a sustainable business.
Moving on, so we've got curriculum, teaching and training. Now, if you recollect in that slide I put up some while ago, which reflected the old education inspection framework, on the left-hand side, you had quality of education, and that was divided into intent, implementation and impact. So if you like, what was referred to as the 3 I's of the curriculum. So some changes here, and I think this is one of the areas where I'm going to be interested to see over time how inspectors approach this, and where there are similarities and differences. Not that it matters particularly much, but I think there's some interesting things to consider. So curriculum design is very much there. Whilst there's no mention formally of the 3 I's, I think the emphasis on curriculum still remains fundamental. So I would anticipate at least that inspectors will continue to have those early discussions in the inspection with the curriculum managers about asking about the whys and wherefores of the curriculum they offer, and why do they offer it, and who's their audience, and so forth. How does that meet local regional needs and so forth? So curriculum stays very important, as does the sequencing of that curriculum. I'm sure that will remain important. And the whole idea of promoting a deeper understanding and developing skills. So that, inspectors will continue to ask questions around why this, why now, what you don't know now that you didn't know 2 months ago. And they're going to be asking the staff that design the schemes of work, what are they doing now, and how does that relate to what they're going to be doing next month or next week or next term? So that whole idea of sequencing. Effective teaching methods, there's still going to be lots of lesson visits and learning walk type activities. Inspectors will never just sit there and judge what the teacher's doing. They'll look at much more besides, but clearly they want to check the effectiveness of the teaching methods that are being employed. So do learners know more than they knew a week ago, a month ago, 3 months ago? Are they able to explain clearly how they're putting their theory into practice and so forth? Assessment and progress tracking, I think there's 2 or 3 important things here. If you're tracking progress, clearly you need to judge what the starting points of the learners are, so that hasn't changed. You need to be using assessment effectively, and you need to make sure that you've got effective processes in place to evaluate that progress. So you can clearly demonstrate to inspectors that learning and skills are developing and learners are getting more confident about what they're doing and more skilled about what they're doing. There's still mention about staff qualifications, staff development opportunities being important. And here, this is mentioned several times, this last one, the idea of being prepared for the next steps. It's really important that as part of identifying the starting points, there's some discussion with learners about what do you want to be doing at the end of this course? How do we make sure through providing this program that you are achieving what you need to achieve and want to achieve so that you are fully prepared for the next steps? And it also hints very strongly at some stuff that we'll talk about in a minute, which is around some of the softer skills development, whether that be English, maths, IT, or whether it be communication skills or what have you. Teamworks, etc. So there's elements, components of that I think fall under this curriculum teaching and training banner.
I think when you look at that, much of that is very similar. It has a slightly different focus, but this shouldn't be news to you. This shouldn't be a big surprise. A lot of it is very similar, just with that slightly more element of inclusion, of is it appropriate for everybody? Have we made sufficient adaptations in how we deliver, what we deliver, when we deliver it? Sequencing is really, really important. And also from the point of view of more in that careers advice and guidance, and making sure that your learners understand and can articulate themselves that it's helpful for their next steps, for their long-term career, or for their next steps in education and training or in employment. So it's not just about the fact that you know it and you've done it for a while, it's about making sure that your learners can articulate it as well. But this shouldn't be, I think this is the most similar aspect that hasn't changed, just with that slightly new focus. But I think this is the element that that hasn't changed too much.
Potentially.
We've got a few more questions that are coming in. It's quite difficult to keep looking at the questions, thinking, how many of those can we answer and how many can't we? And I've just put one in that, as far as we are told, that the new framework from the 10th of November is going to be used. It's not January, it's going to be from November for everybody.
Someone's mentioned about learner voice. I'll talk about this later, but yes, as I understand it, I hope I'm not wrong here, Ofsted will continue to have questionnaires to learners, to employers and to staff during the inspection process. I would anticipate that any provider worth its salt should probably have its own system of gathering learner voice. Gathering learner voice is probably the fundamentally most important thing you need to be able to evaluate the quality of your own provision. Achievement. This was, I guess this is probably what was broadly speaking under curriculum impact before, but I think there's some extra stuff, some extra add-ons. So it's assessment of learner outcomes, so it's looking at achievement rates and so forth. It's looking at whether learners have met their goals, which is more a sort of qualitative judgment, particularly, for example, if you've got learners where you're using RAPA. Addressing achievement gaps. I think some of the sort of Alice Alps EDIM type data that was used in years gone by and sort of petered out to some extent will be a bit more prevalent moving forwards, because clearly you want to be able to demonstrate that your disadvantaged learners are not being disadvantaged in the way you're delivering the curriculum. Skills development and progression, it's not just about outcomes and qualifications and grades, it's about making sure that people are acquiring new skills and knowledge, and that skills and knowledge is enabling them to progress to the next stage. And then that whole idea of sustainability of achievement rates, and making sure that there's continuous improvement, and what you're doing is sustaining the learner and their achievements, that's all sustainable. And there's a phrase that Kerry's put on the bottom of that slide, which I think was used in the webinars and is probably somewhere in the documentation. No one should be left behind.
And I think when you read that Martin Oliver link, you'll kind of see where that comes from, and it's not a Kerry expression, it's actually an Ofsted one, that there's no one left behind. And I think it's important that you have that in the back of your mind when you are looking at the initiatives that you have, all the quality initiatives that you have, all the steps that you're taking, all the changes you're making. Have a look at which one of these achievement criterias it is actually addressing. So when you have taken on new resources, when you've redesigned your curriculum, when you've taken a different approach, Has that, as a result, had an impact on learner outcomes? Has it reduced your achievement gaps? Has it changed the way that learners progress or the speed that they progress? So in other words, or is it improving retention? So have a look at every single one of your initiatives that you've carried out within your business and think, as a result of that initiative, where does that sit in achievement? What has it actually had an impact on? And it may well be that it hasn't, and it's about staff performance. But if it's to do with staff wellbeing and performance, as a result of the staff performance being better, as a result of staff being happier, how has that gone back to achievement? So I would suggest that every single thing you do in your business, it might be an indirect route, but eventually it should have an impact on the elements of achievement for your learners, because at the end of the day, that's how you are measured effectively. Do things work in your business? How does that impact on our learners? Does it help them stay on programme? Does it help them to achieve? Does it move them forward? So it's about making sure that you've got that level and you've linked that as well. That will help with all elements of you understanding your provision. And I'm not going to talk about self-assessment now. I'm going to let James do that later. Right, over to you.
Sorry, just one other thing on achievement. It's not just to do with data. It's very much not to do with data. It's to do with those qualitative judgments as well, and developing softer skills and evaluating achievement in those, as well as just the hard achievement data.
It is, okay. but achievement data is certainly far more important than it was. I know.
I think it probably is, yeah.
Those of us who've been around, and there's nothing new because we've seen 3 or 4 different frameworks, we know that COVID changed the emphasis on achievement data. We know that changed it, but it's back, and it's really back in so much that you need to understand your data. You need to really understand and unpack your retention data, your recruitment, how people are progressing, and your achievement data, because you need to be able to tell that story.
And finally, the final judgment is participation and development. And again, this is a provision level judgment. Simplistically put, and I think this is a bit simplistic, but as a starting point, this broadly is what was under personal development, behaviour and attitude before. But I think there's other components to this, and a few bits have gone under other subheadings here. So what does this include? It's looking at learner engagement and attendance, making sure that there's positive attendance, active engagement in class, and I think the idea of engagement is an interesting one, because inspectors have often had debates over the years about the extent to which learners should be engaged in lessons. I come from the school that suggests that learners probably are learning better if they're more engaged and more actively involved in what's going on. But just because they're engaged doesn't mean they're learning, and just because they may not be engaged doesn't mean that they're not learning. But an interesting point there, I think. Development of resilience and independence, again, some similar themes here to what we've been hinting at before, to do with developing softer skills, to develop confidence and so forth. Enrichment and extracurricular opportunities. I think this is one where, all being well, inspectors will take a pragmatic view here. Clearly, if you're looking at a 16 to 19 cohort, then there probably should be a range of extracurricular activities, enrichment activities and so forth, and you should be covering some of the sort of the PSHE type themes in what you do. If you've got an audience that's predominantly, I don't know, consultant surgeons on a level 7 apprenticeship, some of that stuff is rather less relevant. I'd like to think that inspectors will be pragmatic about how they approach these and look at the things that are relevant to the particular learners that you've got. You've still got mention of British values, behaviours towards each other, as well as professional behaviours. And finally, under this one, the whole idea of careers guidance, which is partly to do with careers information and guidance, but it's also, I suggest, to do with career mapping, making sure that learners are informed about what they might go on to, and they know the sort of skills and courses that they might have to go on to if they're going to get a promotion, as within their employer, or if they're going to move on to university or get a more senior job in another institution, or whatever happens to be. So that gives you a sort of hint at some of the participation and development content there.
On this one, it's quite interesting because on one of the official Ofsted webinars, Paul Cocker actually said about that age-appropriate element for healthy living or healthy relationships. So I can't remember healthy living, but I actually put it into a Q&A to say, can they confirm that that is the case, that there's no expectation for providers who are dealing with adults or mature learners, that they won't be expected to do healthy living or healthy relationships. And what came back was something very similar to what Peter's just said, which is about an expectation that inspectors will have a look at it and deem what is appropriate. It wasn't quite the categoric, no, you don't have to do it, that I was hoping for, but we've got to hope that. And I also think that that's something that we need to feed back to from Finn and say, can we have confirmation about providers, that expectation that if you have got more mature learners, you're not expected to do healthy living, healthy relationships, unless it is part of the course that they're actually doing. So it's that appropriateness of the extracurricular activity. What we don't want is for some of those inspectors to be using that secure fit and be looking for it on their previous experiences, or if they're a college inspector and they're not used to dealing with specifically with higher apprenticeships or more mature learners. So that's something we'll be seeking further clarification for.
Just to kind of reassure people, I think that was one area where within further education and skills, some changes were made after the big listen. And there was a couple of changes made to behaviour and attitudes and personal development. And I think inspectors did take that on board and they were more pragmatic about the sort of things they were judging. And I'd like to think that that level of pragmatism will continue as we move forwards into this new framework.
I agree, but we also need to be able to challenge it when we get some inspectors that don't meet that criteria or that have got their own agenda, and we need to be able to challenge it in a very professional way to say that's not our understanding. This is just a reminder for the Fin members out there to say that, look, you know, they've got a massive library of resources. James is continuously updating. He's going through, you know, he's beavishly working at it, making sure that they are really up to date and relevant. So please do use those resources. And actually, it's only when we get members who use the resources that we get the feedback that say, oh my God, it's amazing. You've got so much in there. I hadn't realized it. So there's an awful lot in there, but we do need you to go and have a look and find those resources out. So, and if anybody would like a session with myself or James talking through the resources to understand them better, or if you've got new stuff coming on, please do let us know, because we're happy to have schedule a half-an-hour session with you to go through the library and help you make the most of that resource. We've already spent the money on making it. James has spent the time doing it, so we want to make sure that your members benefit from it.
Right, so I've talked a bit about the toolkit, and I've talked a bit about the framework. I'm just going to very briefly cover a few practicalities around inspection and the activities that go on or will go on during inspection. These, by and large, you can find if you look at the Further Education and Skills Operating Guide for Inspectors, which I mentioned earlier, and also the Inspection Information for Further Education and Skills Providers. So those unpack this in detail, and I've just kind of got some key headings from those. So we're looking at a 4-year cycle. I asked a question yesterday during the webinar. So if you were inspected under the old EAF, how long is it likely to be until you get your next inspection? I would assume that's going to be about 4 years. And actually the message came back, well, it might be closer to 5 years. So that first inspection after your inspection of the old cycle may be a bit more than 4 years. But, you know, don't worry about it. Just make sure that you're prepared for whenever you happen to get the phone call. In terms of the phone call, the practice is now going to be that you get 5 or 6 working days notice. The role of the nominee continues. We've had it in Further Education and Skills for eons, and it's been the key aspect of inspection that has resulted in significantly fewer complaints under the Further Education Skills inspection cycle relative to schools, because the nominee really oils the wheels, and we'll talk a little bit more about that earlier, because it's really later. It's really important to have the right person as nominee with the right skill set and the right understanding of the process. Inspection types remain the same. So we've got full inspections, we've got monitoring inspections, we've got new provider monitoring visits and various other things. Ofsted have said in the webinars that more information is going to be published on those. So I'm guessing they're going to be fairly similar to what they were before, but I think we need to wait and see. The only change really is, if you're as old as me, you may remember that we used to have short inspections. I can't see any clear indication that short inspections will continue in any way. In fact, I don't think they've been done for a little while yet, a year or two. But ostensibly, the different types of inspections remain the same. The concept of validating self-evaluation gets a few mentions here, and this goes back again, if you're ancient like me and you were around in 1997 under the Further Education Funding Council, you may remember FEFC Circular 9712 and 9713, which is when we first started writing self-assessment reports and formalizing the process where inspection was validating your self-assessment report. I'm not suggesting for a second that it's going back to that level, but there are mentions and there are hints at the fact that inspectors will be wanting to say to you, where do you think you are with regards to the new judgments and the new grades that are awarded? So even if you've self-assessed against the old education inspection framework, something that might just be worth a little bit of thought, particularly over the next 12 months or so if you're inspected during that period. Transparency and reflecting meetings, those were formerly known as keep in touch meetings. There's quite a lot of mention about the fact that, you know, the process of inspection should be transparent, it should be reflective, it should be a positive professional dialogue and communications between the inspection team and the provider. All of that continues. Grades will be awarded based on secure fit. We've talked about that. I think that's quite a significant change. Inspections should be proportionate to the size of the provider. So in other words, if you're a small provider based on one campus with 30 or 40 learners, you're going to have a small team in relation to a large provider that's across multiple campuses with many learner types and so forth. So as ever, the size of the inspection team will be proportionate to your size. And then just moving on.
Right, just before you move on, I would say a word of caution, and I can almost see a number of providers in the background saying, we've just been inspected, that means I'm going to think about this for 5 years. Just don't even think about that, because this is about a framework in place that you need to get your ducks in a row. You need to look at your provision through this lens. It's not about when you get inspected. Don't sit back and think, I don't need to think about this for a few years. You need to think about it now, because you will be expected to deliver to these standards and have evidence going back over the last number of years. So just because you've been inspected doesn't mean to say that you take your foot off the accelerator. You don't. You now need to look at your provision in light of this framework, and also, as Peter's just said, about evaluating your provision under the new heading, and also making sure that your governance and that your leaders do it as well, so that you can actually put the right interventions in place to make sure that everybody has the same opportunities and no one gets left behind, because those kind of initiatives don't happen overnight. They're not something you can do just for inspection. They're things that you put in 12 months, 2 years, 3 years in advance, in preparation to make sure that you've got it. I think, James, do you want to just come in and talk a little bit about self-assessment? I know that Peter's going to talk a little bit about self-assessment in a minute, but do you want to just mention about the resource that you have in the website?
Yeah, will do. I must have a word with my colleague Peter about using the term "when you're as old as I am." I'm going to take issue with him on that, because he mentioned a couple of documents that brought back unhappy memories. You mentioned 9712 and 9713. Sadly, Peter, I remember those to my cost. I hope they never come back. And the other thing we were talking about in terms of, you know, how frequent inspections will be. As many of you know, I keep a database of all provision. And at this moment in time, there are something like 230 providers due a full inspection. Now, during August, September, October, no inspection. So that backlog is all to catch up. So while it might be, 4-year cycle, I think we need to work to that. But if the inspectors stick to that, there's going to be a lot of work to catch up on. Right, self-assessment. Many of you will recollect, if you're sad like me and you read the small print on inspection reports, it's that bit at the very end of the inspection report that said, who contributed, the nominee, staff, and we used the provider's self-assessment report. Now, clearly, during the webinars, Ofsted said, they keep using this term self-evaluation. That's a school thing, self-evaluation. Learning and skills, we tend to refer to self-assessment. But there is no compulsion. You're not required to produce it. But yet, the very last webinar I was on, they said, well, of course, if providers wish to do a self-evaluation, and if they wish to use the toolkit, then they're very welcome to do so. And if they wish to submit it to Ofsted, they're welcome to do so. To me, what does that say? You got to do a self-assessment report. Whether it says that or not doesn't matter. This new toolkit, Peter said at the beginning, there was something like 60 criteria. There are. If you don't know the answer to every single line, I suspect you could be in trouble because, again, at the webinars, it's been clearly stated. One of the first questions you're likely to be asked is, and Peter's already mentioned it, where do you see yourself against this framework? And that's a bit digital. It's either on or off. You've either got an answer to that or you haven't. If you haven't, you're probably going to struggle a wee bit. Sad life I live, I counted there are something like 13 criteria in safeguarding. The biggest one is actually curriculum, which is hardly surprising. Something like 16 criteria in there. That's 16 aspects you've got to answer a question to. So the process I've created is the resource reference is A601. If you're familiar with the Fin website, if you go to that blue bar at the top towards the right-hand side, there's a little white box that says search. And if you key in A601 in that search box, it will find you that self-assessment template. The beginning and the end is much the same as the old self-assessment template. The bit in the middle is quite different. And all I've done is copied the criteria under the expected standard into a table. Appears on the left. I could show it, but it means Kerry coming out of this presentation. We'll not do that. So on the right-hand side, it leaves you space for a response. And I would suggest your responses are short bullet points. The document, as the template shows, there are about 19 pages of it. Now you might think, what? But if you actually go back to an EIF self-assessment report, the majority of them kind of fit it. Well, the worst one I seen was from a university. It was 113 pages, so I asked them to do a rewrite. But most self-assessment reports come in around 16 to 24 pages, something like that. Depends on how big a provider you are. So I think 19 pages, and predominantly what you're doing is filling in spaces. But I think it's incumbent upon every single person on the call to get hold of that document, look at the expected standard. I haven't changed those. It's lifted straight from the toolkit, and agree what is our response. And if you haven't got a response, then it's back to the drawing board and think, well, what are we going to say about this? And then you're going to look at the report on one hand, but on your other hand, you're probably going to have the toolkit, and you may need to look up or look down and see is there, okay, we're not quite clear what we're putting in the expected standard. Is that going to need attention? You have to make those kind of decisions. So hopefully that template is going to help you. But A601, I'm sure some of you are already pulling up.
Thanks, James.
It's a Word document, so you can edit as you please.
Thank you so much, James. And I think what we'll do is on one of the months of the Fin Unwrapped, we'll actually have a focused session on that. So I'm very conscious that we're running up. Thank you very much indeed for that, James. That's great.
Yeah, I'll have my eye on the time. We've got 10 minutes left, so I'm just going to crack through the last few slides, which have got some kind of useful stuff in to consider. Inspection activities. The big change is that there's no longer something called deep dives, which I think is fabulous, because I was never a great fan of deep dives. If you look down the list of the sort of activities that inspectors will be carrying out, it's not dramatically changed. So it's lesson visits, learning walks, work and skills scrutiny, discussions with learners, with teachers, with employers, with parents where appropriate, visits to workplaces, meeting with curriculum leaders, case sampling, etc. The only subtle difference is the introduction of this idea of case sampling, but to be honest, it's not a million miles from some of the stuff we did under the previous cycle. The main point to bear in mind here, as with deep dives, the nominee, the lead inspector would say to the nominee, you know what we've seen, we've discussed what we're going to see. Are you satisfied that that is truly representative of your organisation? And the lead inspector would be desperate to get a response, yes, we think that's representative. I'm sure they're still going to be asking that same question. So they're going to look at the coverage that's being achieved, and the lead inspector will say, are you satisfied that we have adequately had representation or sampling to represent what you stand for and what you are? So I think that'll continue, but nothing dramatically different there as far as I'm concerned. Right, let's just move on. A few observations from us and also a few sound bites from Ofsted, which I think are worth a little bit of time to reflect upon, possibly just briefly here, but you may want to kind of look at some of these things in due course. So if you look at the judgments that are being made across the whole provider, the key themes here are to do with leadership, they're to do with organizational culture, systems that support the quality of education, accountability of leaders, governance, and so forth. If you look at the provision level, it's more to do with the learner experience, a bit like the section that's in the old reports, what's it like to be a learner? So lived experiences of learners, their perceptions, what they study, how it's taught, and so forth. So that just kind of gives you a bit of a flavour for those two, the differences between those two sections. We know now that there's a significantly sharpened focus on inclusion while still retaining the curriculum quality and learner outcomes as central pillars. And the 3 I's are not explicitly mentioned, but they remain implicit in what inspectors are going to be looking at. So just some thoughts there. Moving on. There's a stronger emphasis on leadership as a drive for sustained improvement, and also of governors. So the question that inspectors are going to be asking, what do you do that's really good? What are your issues and so forth? Inclusion is there as a key theme. Joint activities during inspection. Yeah, so anticipate the fact that the lead inspector will say, where possible, do you have a manager that can carry out joint learning walks or lesson visits with our inspectors? So that, I think, will be fairly high profile. There's a strong emphasis on staff welfare and well-being during the inspection, so much so that inspections can be paused. Quite how that's going to work, we'll just have to see in practice. And then if you look at the documentation, there's a strong emphasis on those 3 words: achieve, belong, and thrive. So inspectors are going to be looking at how learners achieve, how they belong, and how they thrive. And the whole message there is inspection is designed to support self-improvement and inclusive practice. Moving on.
One of the ones that we just wanted to mention was that there is something, and it hasn't cropped up before, they've talked about deferring, pausing, and gathering more information for an inspection. So it's just worth that is something that they have talked about. We don't know how that's going to look. That's something that they've just invented is the wrong word, but they've just published that they're going to do, to be mindful of. We're not sure what the criteria is to pause an inspection, but that's something that they are aware of. And I think that's basically from the tragedy of that head teacher. So it's just about looking. They are evolving, they are moving forward, but over time we'll be able to clarify with Ofsted some of the detail. So some of the sound bites.
So these were a few things that for me jumped off the webinar. There's this talk about taking context into account, and there's this new tool which is going to be available called the online insight platform. This is an Ofsted database of some sort. I did ask a question on the call, how do people get access to it? Didn't get a response, so that's something that we need to discover. But I'm anticipating that insights platform will be where inspectors use it, and you can use it to kind of make sure that you understand, or that they understand, what the provider is all about. There's mention of a steady and assured start. That basically means that they're not doing loads of inspections in the first few months. They're going to take things fairly steadily. But as James intimated earlier, that means that they're not going to get quite that many inspections done in the first year relative to when they get up to full speed, which I think will have some sort of impact on the period between inspections. No one left behind, we've already heard. The secure fit approach, we've talked about that. Ofsted are emphatic that the toolkit is not a checklist. They are emphatic about that. And so I think we need to respect their comments about that. Context, collaboration, constructive advice, and continued focus on well-being all get a mention. And then I think I've hinted at this fairly strongly already, but this was said by a senior colleague on the policy team who I rate very highly. He said leaders and governors should calibrate their thinking on the 5-point scale, leaders and governors. So in other words, if you're inspected, particularly if you're inspected over the next 9 to 12 months before you've got a new self-assessment report, you might like to calibrate your thinking in line with the 5-point scale. And no surprise, English, maths, digital skills remain a core factor, and they're not taking a back seat in any way, shape or form.
So we will be working with Ofsted closer in the future about the new framework. So there'll be more information for Fin members coming shortly about opportunities to meet with Ofsted through Fin and through utilising our information and sharing with Ofsted about the feedback from the pilots and from our members' events. We won't necessarily invite them to the members' events because we want people to speak freely to those monthly events, but they are keen to work with us, which is fantastic. So more about that coming out in the future. For those of you who haven't booked on and want to hear more of Peter and myself, Peter and I will be delivering the boot camp with other colleagues in November. That's now fully booked, and we've also got dates available for the next nominee boot camp, which will be available in January. And as I said, you'll get more of me and Peter, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. We'll get to see if they want to see more of us, Peter. And for those of you who are concerned about your provision and are keen to know how it would sit against the new framework, we do offer quality reviews, which is a separate service, so we can provide you with a quote, and we can talk to you about how we would help you and do a review for you against the new framework and work with you on that. So please do get in touch if that's something that you would like a price on. For Fin members, we're also going down a funding route. We're going to be providing resources in relation to compliance, because we know that you need to keep the system going. One of the things that we want to leave you with is that whatever you do, don't just do it for inspectors, do it for the learners. If we've always said at Fin, if you focus on quality, then inspection will look after itself. That has not changed. Yes, there's new detail in the framework. Yes, you need to understand it. You need to look at the toolkit, but actually everything in it is about the learners, and it's about putting the learners at the heart of what you do. Now, there's loads of questions that we've had. We're not going to be able to cover all those questions today. What we will do is take a notice of the questions, and we will be sharing some of the responses. And also, for those of you who are Fin members, we will highlight where that particular event will be coming in more detail. We've had some questions about accessing resources and members and such, so we'll look at those individually and we'll go into much more detail. And thank you very much for coming today. We would like you to complete evaluation. We'll send you out an evaluation, and somebody's put that it's much clearer than the Ofsted website, so thank you very much. That's great that they started the process off for it. We now hopefully have provided you with a bit more information, that layering it up, and I'm sure there'll be more events in the future. So thank you so much indeed. Thank you both to Peter and James for helping me with today. And we've really enjoyed working with you. So this is just the start of many more interventions and conversations along the way. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, colleagues.